Today's scripture reading comes from Exodus chapter 1 verses 8 through 12, verse 22, and chapter 2 verses 1 through 5. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and, in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. And our New Testament reading is from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is this child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may go and pay him homage as well." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary and his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. So, I must say that I'm really excited to be doing this sermon series. Growing up, one of my favorite stories, of course, is the Christmas story, the story of Jesus. There's so much theologically that we can pull from the idea that God came down as a child and, the vulnerability of that and whatnot. And going through seminary really even opened my eyes more, because I realized that every bit of that story I took was true to an extent in that it's in the Bible, but each piece of the story came from a different part of the Bible, a different gospel, and that, in fact, if you read one gospel, you're not going to find a complete Advent story. You're going to find a part of it. And in two of those gospels, Mark and John, you're not going to find an Advent, well, you're not going to find a nativity story at all. There is Advent in there, which is why I've included them in the series. But it's just so exciting to me. Now, last week we talked about how for Mark, there was really no need. Mark didn't see a need to talk about the birth story. For Mark, the coming of Christ was really signified by his baptism in the Jordan River, and Christ alone heard the message revealed to him within himself. "You are my son, with whom I am well pleased." And then the Spirit drove him into the wilderness, and he the rest is history, right? He did the ministries he did, he died. And in fact, he spent his whole ministry in Mark trying to keep people from knowing who he was. He got this revelation to himself after coming out of the water, and then the rest of the gospel is like, okay, I healed you, don't tell anybody. Shh, you know, come on. Like I was, you know, lame, and now all of a sudden I'm walking, people are going to question me, you know, I'm going to tell people. So, you know, but in the end, as Jesus is hanging on the cross, the only person, aside from the demons and God himself, the only other person that recognized Jesus was the Son of God is the Roman centurion, as he's looking up after crucifying him on the cross and saying, truly, he was the Son of God. So that's Mark's story. Today, we're entering into Matthew. Matthew is the second gospel that was written. Out of the gospels that we have in the gospel, it was the second one. Mark was written first. And Matthew pulls from Mark, but we'll see. Let's journey through Matthew and see what Matthew does. So the question I want to ask you today, and really it's almost a question for each week in this sermon series, what does it mean to be the Messiah? What does it mean to be the Messiah? Messiah is a Jewish concept, of course. In Judaism, Messiah, Mashiach, means anointed one. So, we have this, as Christians, we think of Jesus as being, when we hear Messiah, we think of Jesus. Oh, it's Jesus, you know, Jesus is the Messiah. But in reality, every king that was a king of Israel was anointed by God's prophet, meaning that that king had God's blessing. Meaning that the people had to obey the king because the king was acting under the authority of God. So each king being anointed was Mashiach, the Messiah. What God promises is that one day, after David was, you know, loyal and faithful, he said to David, your line will continue forever and ever, and one day an heir will come from your line who will save your people. That's at least what the prophets were heralding. Now, of course, David's long gone by the time Isaiah is writing, but he's thinking back to the good old days with David and saying, one day, God promises that a ruler from the line of David will do what is necessary to save God's people and to bring restoration to God's people. One day, a ruler will come from the line of David that will save the world. So this is the language that Isaiah has. Matthew's community, though, did not take Jesus' messiahship for granted like we do today. The author of Matthew, who remains anonymous, you know, the funny thing is we attribute names to these, you know, like the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke and John. You know, out of all those Gospels, Luke is perhaps the one that may have the right name attributed to it. And there's reasons for that, which I can explain later. But Mark, Matthew, and John, they didn't come out and say, hey, I'm Matthew and I'm writing my Gospel, and, you know, but people tried to guess, well, who wrote it? Well, I think Matthew did, and they were trying to give it apostolic authority, meaning they were trying to say that an apostle wrote it, so it had the authority of it, you know. Well, clearly one of Jesus' disciples taught it, or wrote it, so it must be true. But in reality, they're anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. And that's the same is true for Matthew. But what we do know is that he probably lived in Antioch, which is in Syria. And he probably lived in a community that was richly diverse but had a large Jewish population. So, he also, it would be good to say, spoke pretty good Greek. When we look at Mark, his Greek is kind of rudimentary. When we look at Matthew, it's good Greek. So he spoke Greek as his primary language, though he would have been familiar with some Aramaic and stuff because he was probably a part of a Jewish community. But they were Hellenized, and they were living outside of the Promised Land, so to speak. And his purpose for writing the Gospel, Matthew's purpose for writing the Gospel, was to show Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish promise of the coming of the Messiah. So, you know, Mark calls Jesus the Messiah, but for Matthew, Mark leaves way too many unanswered questions. I mean, he starts off at the baptism, almost suggesting that Jesus didn't know who he was until God told him. Well, that wasn't good enough for Mark. Like, the king would know he's a king. Otherwise, where is his claim to the throne? It's not good enough to Mark that Jesus was a peasant, because peasants don't have a rightful claim to the throne. So Matthew starts off his gospel going through the lineage of Jesus, from Abraham on, and of course in the middle connects David. And where is Jesus born? Bethlehem, because that's where David was born. So Jesus is the Messiah promised in Scripture, as Matthew interprets it anyway. Just as in Mark, the author does claim that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, which we can find in Matthew chapter 16, verse 16. It's funny, in Mark, when Jesus says, you know, who am I? Who do people say I am? You get, oh, you're Elijah, or you're one of the prophets of old. And then he says, okay, but who do you say I am? And Peter responds, you are the Messiah. End of story in Mark. And you can see Jesus after the transfiguration going, you know, like, Jesus got very frustrated with his disciples in Mark. In Matthew, on the other hand, when Jesus asks that question, who do you say that I am? That Peter falls on his knees and answers, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, in Mark, but Matthew, again, Matthew's gospel is quite different from Mark's Jesus. Matthew's Jesus is quite different from Mark's Jesus. Mark's Jesus was a frustrated teacher who could not seem to get his students to understand his teachings for the life of him. He says that he teaches parables to confuse the people in Mark. He wants to confuse the people. So naturally his disciples go, what do these parables mean? And Jesus is like, okay, I'll tell you. And he gives them the secret to his parables and what they mean. And then later they're like, what does that mean? And he's like, come on, you know, like, do you still not understand? You got to count how many times he says, do you still not understand to his disciples in Mark? It's incredible. But in Matthew, Jesus is this brilliant teacher who woos his listeners with his words, and his enemies soon learn how hard it is to track him. They try and they try and they try, but Jesus' knowledge of the law is impeccable. Mark has Jesus trying to keep his identity a secret up until his death on the cross. Matthew has Jesus' identity loudly announced from his birth onward. This brings us to Jesus' birth story. Matthew is referring to Mark's gospel when writing his own, no doubt. But for Matthew, Mark's gospel leaves way too many unanswered questions, especially for Jewish Christians and Jews in general when it comes to Jesus' messiahship. Again, it's not good enough that you call him Messiah. How do we know he's Messiah? So Matthew sets out to prove Jesus' messiahship. Matthew sets out with the mission to connect Jesus to Jewish prophecy as the Messiah. Jesus is the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, according to Matthew. He does this by positioning Jesus, actually, as the next Moses. You know, it's great that Jesus is in the line of David. That sets him clearly in line for being on the throne. But Jesus is more than that. Because do you remember in the story of Moses, of course the first 5 books are supposedly by tradition written by Moses, and in Deuteronomy, Moses says that a prophet like him will rise up, and the people who listen to him shall be blessed, and the ones who don't shall perish. And so Jesus is this next prophet. And how does Matthew do this? Matthew does this by positioning Jesus in a way that Moses was positioned. We heard in the Old Testament how Moses was a little baby, and Pharaoh set out to kill all little Hebrews because they were flourishing too well in his land. So the mother puts him in a basket and floats him down the river. Where does he end up? In the Pharaoh's daughter's arms, embraced by Egypt. Jesus, born in the city of David, right? Born in Bethlehem.